Okay, so welcome back. And one of the reasons that this was a natural stopping point is because here is a wonderful moment where Jules Doinel goes, to use the technical terminology, batshit crazy. Now, there's some suggestion that Doinel was always a bit of an unstable character. And as much as I want to say that we oughtn't to be dismissive of his spiritual transmission, if you're having visions of the Aeon Jesus, it casts a certain doubt upon your mental stability. And as a personality, Doinel seemed to be a little unstable and occasionally hard to work with. In late 1894, or perhaps early 1895, he suddenly leaves the Gnostic Church. He resigns his patriarchate, resigns his episcopacy, and converts to Roman Catholicism.
Oh, I thought you were going to say converts to Buddhism.
And converts to Buddhism. No, that's somebody else. He resigns from his Masonic lodge, and he is an important officer in his Masonic lodge. Why does he do this? Well, we all know, and we can put it in one simple name: Leo Taxil. The Palladium scandal. Now, if you don't know about the Palladium scandal, this is a wonderful, wonderful bit of history in the Gnostic Church. Leo Taxil begins to publish claims that Freemasonry is controlled by a secret organization called the Palladium, headed by Albert Pike. And it is satanic. It is satanic at its core. And that the goal of Freemasonry is to, under the veil of non-denominational or even Christian symbolism, to spread Satanism. And it is a political order, it seeks temporal power, and it is involved in certain kinds of sexual deviancy and sexual magic. Taxil begins to work with Doinel. And Doinel is actually probably one of the co-writers with Taxil of the Lucifer Unmasked. This is the great book that's published. That is the great expose of the satanic roots of Freemasonry. So as a result of this understanding that he comes to have that Freemasonry is satanic, and since the religion of Freemasonry is Gnosticism, by extension, Gnosticism is satanic.
Hear, hear.
In 1897, Leo Taxil admits that the whole thing was a hoax, that he made the whole thing up. And he made it up to embarrass the Roman Catholic Church. This was his whole point. So all of a sudden, Doinel has thrown in with a hoaxer. He's thrown in with somebody who has torn down everything that he has built up over the last 5 years. And one might imagine that the church would simply be left in a shambles. But Doinel, for all of his instability and all of his perhaps insanity, had laid a very firm foundation for his church, and it continues on without him. And continues on under a new patriarch, which is Fabre des Essarts. Fabre des Essarts has the ecclesiastical name of Taus Synesius. Now, just a quick, I didn't mention this before. All of the terminology, Tau, yes, sorry.
You're missing your microphone.
No, it's on the we've moved it so that it's not swinging back and forth. The use of the term Tau as a title for bishops has its origins in Doinel's church. And so whenever a Gnostic bishop uses the designation Tau, that is an implicit claim that they have a succession from Doinel's church. That's the only way you get to claim that Tau. So all of the bishops have the term Tau. The female bishops are called Sophias. So you have Taus and Sophias. And there's some suggestion that the original plan for the structure is that what we would call a diocese, every diocese would have a Tau and a Sophia, that there would be a male and a female bishop to co-administrate that region. In practice, just as we find ourselves today with an undue concentration of testosterone, so too the early Gnostic church was dominated by men, in part because of its roots in Freemasonry. This is a big part of that. But there are at least 2 Sophias, I think, that we know of that were consecrated in this period. Fabre des Essarts becomes the new patriarch under the title of Tau Synesius. And he works extensively with Louis Sophron Frugarian, Tau Sophronius. And it is Synesius that really begins to build the Gnostic Church, the EGU, that we are actually more familiar with, that we think of when we think of the early movement of ecclesiastical Gnosticism. He claims to be combining 3 separate organizations, 3 separate lines. The first is the Fabre Palaprat Church, the Saint Église du Christ. And I think it is important to note that the only name that Fabre Palaprat ever uses for his church is the Holy Church of Christ. That's all it's ever called. These other designations of the Johannite Church, which is sometimes called, or the Primitive Christian Church, the Église chrétienne primitive de Saint-Jean, these are descriptions. These are not titles. And I think what has happened over the last 100 years or so is, in a lot of cases, the church itself, when it gets described, oh, this is the primitive church of St. John Christians, say, oh, well, that's the name of it. It's not. That's just a description of it. It is simply called the Saint Église du Christ. Other names are simply descriptive rather than nominative. So there's the first part of that. Other parts are going to be included in this later. Milka Bogart, who has been one of my primary sources, and I owe a huge debt to Milka for a lot of this information, claims that this becomes incorporated into Fabre des Essarts Church, but he never says how that happens. He never says how that stream comes in.
I thought it was Bricot that made the claim to be the fusion.
No, Synesius actually makes reference to this as well. Later on, we're going to get these other streams under Bricot. Now, after the Taxil hoax has played itself out, and after Jules Doinel realizes that he's been taken for a ride, essentially. Question?
You mentioned 3 streams that were combined, but you want to talk.
We're going to come back to the other 2. When he realizes that he's been taken for a ride in 1900, he reapproaches Fabre des Essarts and is reconsecrated in the Gnostic Church under a different name as Tau Jean. So Tau Jean becomes, he does not reclaim his position as patriarch. He is simply a legionary bishop within the Gnostic Church. So he is now subordinate to the people that he himself consecrated. 3 years later, Doinel dies. So this is a very, very short period. His death in 1903, Doinel's death in 1903, effectively marks the end of the first stage of the restoration. Whatever is being restored, this is the first stage's end. And Tau Synesius is sort of the bridge between the first and second stages. In 1901, Synesius consecrates Jean Bricot, also under the name of Tau Jean. Excuse me, I've made a mistake. When Doinel is reaccepted, he takes the name Tau Jules. I was wondering why that looked peculiar. He's reaccepted as Tau Jules. Bricot is consecrated as Tau Jean. So Jean Bricot, usually referred to, everybody calls him Johnny. Johnny Bricot is consecrated as Tau Jean.
At 20 years old.
At 20 years of age. Between 1903 and 1910, Synesius consecrates an additional 12 bishops. So we've got the synod for the Gnostic Church at this point is is huge. We're talking about a synod of probably 18 to 20 at least. And you've got to realize that in many cases, they are constituting probably half to a third of the clergy of the church. So it's very, as we would now say, it's very top-heavy. Its hierarchy is extremely top-heavy. There are good reasons for this. Gnosticism is never a spiritual practice for observers. It's never, you can never really just sit on the outside. That Gnostic churches, by their very nature, call for a kind of active participation. And those who are drawn to a Gnostic church often are drawn as clergy. They often feel this call to clerical participation. And so Gnostic churches as a whole tend to be a little bit top-heavy, tend to be a little more clergy-oriented than laity-oriented. This is actually changing now in the 21st century, where we have, because of the wider acceptance and the wider diffusion of and dissemination of Gnostic ideas, we're starting to see people who are interested in this, have their own spiritual practices, but aren't necessarily called to the clerical state. At this point, most of the people who are getting involved with these Gnostic churches feel themselves called to the clergy and receive consecration from Synesius. Interestingly, among these people is René Guénon, the great traditionalist thinker, who later will leave the Gnostic church and convert to Sufi Islam and become the first European sheikh of a Sufi order. So he becomes a very, very important person. Guénon is still very, very widely read in a lot of circles. But I mentioned the 1901 consecration of Bricault. And in 1907, Bricault breaks away from Synesius' church. He splits off from Synesius' church. This is strange, because this is a bit of the history that's often glossed over. Because we often think of Bricault simply as the successor to Synesius. And if somebody's going to give you this sort of quick and dirty narrative of the Gnostic church in the beginning of late 19th, early 20th century, what they'll tell you is Doinel, Fabre des Essarts, Bricault. That's not exactly right. Bricault is not a successor to Synesius. He's a schismatic. And certainly this is clear from Synesius' viewpoint. He explicitly says that anybody who has broken away is a schismatic. So we've already got, in the first, 17 years of this church, our first major schism. So we've now got Synesius' church and Bricault's church. Bricault's church becomes the dominant church simply because he takes away most of the big guns. Most of the leading lights of Martinism, Freemasonry, Theosophy go with Bricault rather than remaining with Synesius, especially Uncos, especially Papas.
Can you give us a quick description of what the schism is over?
It seems to be primarily a personality issue. I don't know that it's any more than that. Do you have any,
No.
I mean, it really does get glossed over in a profound way. So Bricault's split off. It may have been some theological basis. There may have been some practical basis. He may not have thought that Synesius wasn't doing enough.
The I want to be the boss syndrome.
I think that's probably it. It's simply, I want to be the patriarch, so I'm going to split off my church. I'm planning to do that pretty soon.
Yeah.
Just so you know. I know you've seen that one coming for a long time.
Well, after you've done that, I'll have to up the stakes by being Bodhi Dharma.
Oh, well, you're already going to do it.
I'll edit that out.
So this is where we get this claim to incorporate these three streams completely. And the three streams that are being incorporated are Doinel's EGCU, the Église Gnostique Catholique Universelle, Vintras' Carmelite Church. Now, we mentioned this earlier on. Tau Thomas asked whether the Carmelite Church, the church of Vintras, had been carried through. It doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, Some people have claimed that no less a person than Teilhard, the great Martinist light, claimed that the association with Vincius and also with Fabre Palapra is invented by Bricaud. This is something that Bricaud invents in order to give authority to his church. So there's the Doinel Church, Vincius's Carmelite Church, and Fabre Palapra's Saint Église du Christ. So, where these Vintresian and Palaprat lines come from, it's really a big question. Supposedly, the succession from the Johannite source, from Fabre Palapra's source, comes through a man by the name of Bernard Clément, about whom we know nothing. He just sort of shows up, claims to be not only a successor to Fabre Palapra's church, that is to say somebody who possesses the lineage, but somebody who has the authority to hand over the power of that church. It's important to acknowledge that simply having a lineage through consecration, for example, in a church is not the same as having authority in that church. For example, we have Episcopal lineages that pass from the Roman Catholic Church, but we're not the Roman Catholic Church. And if we made any claims to authority over the Roman Catholic Church, that would be absurd. That would be ridiculous. Similarly, we have streams that come from other Gnostic churches, but we don't claim as a result of that lineage to have authority in those churches. So if in fact Bernard Clément was able to really incorporate the Saint Église du Christ into Bricaud's church, he would have had to have been the successor. Now, how does that work? Either he is the named successor and there are other bishops, or he's the only one. You know, there is that possibility that he's just the last one left. Since the claim has been made that this transmission has been secret, that it is not something that is widely disseminated, we have no way of knowing that. And it seems to me that the claim that he is somehow the lineal descendant and has the authority to incorporate this into Bricaud's church, that seems specious to me. I think you have to make a lot of assumptions. You have to make a lot of claims for which there can never be any kind of basis in order to assert that Bricaud's church has absolute authority over Fabre Palapra's church. Do they have a lineage that comes through Fabre Palapra's church? That seems like a much more reasonable kind of claim. That seems like a much more legitimate claim. So he claims to be sort of fusing together these three streams, and is accused by more than one person of inventing these associations. I find it interesting, and I may be mistaken about how this plays out. If, in fact, Bricaud had received consecration from, probably a subconditione consecration from, and authority from somebody who was the successor to Fabre Palapra's church, would have had succession from Mauviel, from Châtel, from the other founders of these churches. It seems peculiar that Bricaud's church does not claim apostolic succession until they receive the consecration from the Abbé Julio. Because
6 years later.
6 years later, because it would seem at that point that they would have a legitimate lineal succession from the constitutional bishops of the French Revolution.
And it would be older than the, I mean, it would
It'd be older than the Villot line.
Yeah, it would have to be, it would be the original source of their apostolic authority, if so.
And they don't seem to claim that. So it seems very, very peculiar. If, in fact, Bernard Clément was a holder of that lineage, why don't they claim apostolic succession at this point? Now, there could be lots of answers for that. They simply may not have considered it important at that time. It may have been an oversight of some sort. But I think it is a legitimate question that needs to be raised. And it is important to note that Fabre des Essarts is still around. he hasn't fallen off the map somewhere. His church is still in existence, and he is explicit, as I said, that Bricoe's church is a schism. It is a breakaway. From 1913 forward, there's a lot of development in the Gnostic churches. But 13, I think, marks the point at which we would talk about the Gnostic Restoration. If I link the Gnostic Restoration specifically to Doinel's mission. Because it is in 1913 that apostolic, traditional Christian apostolic succession enters into Bricoe's church through Louis-Marie François Giraud, who is a disciple of the Abbé Julio, who was held the succession from René Villat. So the Villat succession comes through Abbé Julio and Louis-Marie François Giraud. So that really marks a kind of break in the history at this point, because up until from the reception of the original charge in 1888, the foundation of the Gnostic Church in 1890, up until 1913, the whole claim to authority rests on Doinel's succession. The whole claim to authority rests on Doinel's spiritual consecration. And in 1913, we start to see these other aspects coming in. In 1918, Bricoe consecrates Victor Blanchard as Tau Targelius. Bricoe dies in 1934, so he stays around for a good long time, and is succeeded by Constant Chevillon. Constant Chevillon, as we all know, is assassinated in 1944 by Vichy thugs, by purporting to be police officers. Now, his successor is Charles-Henri Dupont. And I've not been able to find a whole lot of information about Dupont, because it is much later that René Chambillon appears as a kind of successor to Chevillon. And there's a very peculiar sort of Byzantine path. Chambillon is consecrated by someone who is consecrated by Victor Blanchard. So his claim to succession goes back to Bricoe, which is why, Bricoe, which is why I mentioned Bricoe's consecration of Victor Blanchard. The one thing that I considered using the sketchpad for was to try to trace the family tree, and decided that would create more confusion rather than less. After Chevillon's assassination, it is Chambillon who takes over. He is consecrated in 1945, after Chevillon's death. And Robert Amadou is consecrated at the same time. Why is this significant for us? Well, one of our lines of succession comes through Robert Amadou via Bertel Persson from the Order of Corporate Union. From Persson, it goes to Louis Kaiser. Louis Kaiser has either consecrated or shared consecrations with the vast majority of active Gnostic bishops at this point. This is important because there have been claims made that the succession directly to Bricoe is held only in a very, very small church. This is false. This is a lie. And because that succession passes through a number of different churches.
It also skips Kaiser. It goes through Person, but it also goes a few other spots. So it isn't just.
So
Kaiser,
there are other directions.
But it is passed on absolutely.
Yeah, it is widely
Does it
disseminated.
go from Pearson to Val?
Yeah,
To Val Matthews.
but there's
And
some in
then
between.
directly to us?
Yeah, there's some in between.
Yeah, and to many other Gnostic churches. So in our liturgy, when we talk about all of the holders of the lines of our beloved disciple, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of people. So we are fully willing to recognize that line of succession has passed to the whole of the Gnostic
Also,
Church.
Robert Ambla.
Yeah, I'm going to get to Amblin in just a second. Robert Amblin, who is one of the great lights of Martinism, is one of the great forces behind the restoration of the Cohen order. Ultimately, puts the Église Gnostique Universelle, Église Gnostique Catholique, to sleep in favor of his own Église Gnostique Apostolic. And so, if we look at the historical development through the 20th century, the proper successor jurisdictionally to Bricout's church, at least, if not Doinel's church, and that's going to depend on how you read the schism from Bricout, comes through the EGA. The EGA is the most direct line back to the Bricout church. There's no doubt about that. So this has become, the variety and the breadth of the Gnostic churches that we find at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. I think the history can rest there. We can stop with our history there. But I do want to turn back to and really simply raise it as a question. I'm sorry, is there a historical question?
Yes, what happened to Tassinesius?
I don't have a good answer for that. I don't think it's unknown. I simply think it's outside of my research. I don't know if his church continues on.
Oh, no, I was just going to mention something about the Église Gnostique.
I don't know if he continues to work or whether that simply sort of fizzles. We know that Bricout at least has a strength of personality, and Bricout seems to have been just kind of a magnetic personality. Takes with him most of the people from Synesius' church.
Synesius' church did continue into the 20s, and he was consecrating people.
So he was still consecrating people into the 20s. Do we know what happens after that?
No.
Okay.
My only question is, how many Église Gnostique Apostoliques are there?
I'd run out of fingers and toes.
Because you mentioned earlier talking about being direct back to Bricout, and I was going to say, well, which
I think
which EGA are we talking
any
about?
of the autocephalous EGAs certainly
Fair
have a
enough.
claim.
Yeah.
I mean, any of the, because with the declaration that each of the EGA bishops were essentially autocephalous,
Yeah.
each one of them can claim to have a more or less direct path. I was thinking on Blan's EGA.
So I was going to say, so there's no single one.
No, absolutely
That's-
not.
yeah.
I think that at the time of Amblin's EGA,
Yeah.
that one church,
Yeah.
that EGA was the successor to the EGU. At this point, that has become widely disseminated as well.
Yeah.
So, and we have there are a number of people who claim to be the preeminent or the primate or the patriarch of this or the Catholicos of that, and they have their successions through EGA. But just as we said that, no single church, just because I have a lineage from a church does not necessarily mean I have authority over it, does not necessarily mean that I can claim possession of Bricout's church, for example.
Isn't it all just word association in the end? It's using common nomenclature, for lack of a better word, to create, maybe not consciously, but the illusion of a link with a previous organization.
Well, there are links to those organizations, and I think the problem comes when we overstate the authority that comes with those links, when we overstate the jurisdictional and organizational authority that comes with those spiritual links. I don't know of anybody who uses the terminology of EGA that does not have the lineage. But lineage is not necessarily authority, and that's an important distinction.
I just
Why
want
don't
to
we
say
just take a quick break here, guys?
goodbye and thank you.
Thank you so much.
I enjoyed my stay with you very much.
Have a safe journey home, sir.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I think that anybody I don't know of anybody who's using that terminology who doesn't have a claim to the lineage.
To the spiritual lineage.
Right, but
Yeah.
lineage is not necessarily
Sorry,
authority.
but that's sort of what I mean, is that, are they trying to associate themselves? if they have the claim to spiritual lineage, which we all know we do, why is there the incessant need to make it look like you're somebody that you're not?
Well, because there is a, I think a lot of it has to do, ultimately, I'm just going to lay it on the line here, it's marketing.
Well,
There's a kind of appeal that comes if I can claim to be the successor to Robert Amblin's church, which
And
is
there's a
the
vacuum.
successor to the EGU.
There's a vacuum, so.
Well, I think there's a practice, a work, and many other things in that vacuum where somehow authority, et cetera, will make up for a lack of substance, a lack of ethics, a lack of
Well, in many cases,
options. You know what I mean?
in many cases we find that those who emphasize their direct lineal authority do so because that's their only claim to
Yes.
legitimacy.
Yes.
Now, if you're actually doing the work, you don't worry so much about those things.
I mean, there are churches I've seen out there that have more information about how important they are than where you can find them for a sacrament or a cup of coffee.
Right, yeah.
I think that's absolutely true.
Fair enough.
So, I think that what this leaves us with when we look at this history, and if we're going to talk about the Gnostic restoration, is this question that I started out with. What's getting restored? I think it's easy to say that it is Gnosticism that's getting restored. And I don't think that that's wrong. I don't think that that's wrong, that Doinel takes a step towards restoring Gnosticism to its rightful place as a legitimate spiritual option. Which it does not, I mean, through most of the 19th century, it simply doesn't appear as a legitimate spiritual option, except in very, very confined spaces. So he's restoring that as a legitimate option. I think that that's too broad in some sense, though. And I think that when we look at the importance of the divine feminine in the original charge, the Valentinian structure of Gnosticism, the Cathar sacraments and structure, and the Gnostic symbolism, that all of this is being restored, I think that gets us closer to the question of the real meaning of the restoration for really the period from, as I said, 1888 through 1913. Of all of these, if I were to look at any of these and say, what of these is most important? It's Gnostic symbolism. That's where I would come down. Now, I don't claim to speak for anybody else or claim that as authoritative. But for me, what the restoration of Gnostic symbolism means is not that the symbols themselves are represented for us, because those symbols have been there all along. But the symbols become infused with life in a profound way. They become infused with meaning. That the symbols of the Gnostic Church, the symbols that we associate with the practice of the Gnostic Church, once again become living, meaningful symbols. And so that claim that the restoration of the hierarchy, or the reestablishment, of the hierarchy allows for the restoration of Gnostic symbolism, I think is the most potent of those. Because when we take those symbols and we give life to them, when we take these symbols and we make them meaningful, when we take these symbols and we allow them to have spiritual power, that's real work. That is the work from which all of these other things flow. The restoration of the divine feminine to its proper place in religion only happens if the symbols become infused with life. The restoration of the Cathar sacraments and the Cathar structure is meaningless unless those symbols have power, unless they have life. And the reestablishment of Valentinian, of a specific cosmogonical structure in Gnosticism, is meaningless unless those symbols become infused with power. And so I think that these proclamations of the Synod are important claims, and they tell us something very, very important about who we are as one of the many inheritors of this Gnostic Church. How are we doing on time, Anthony? So what time is it?
You've been going 34 minutes.
Okay. Wait, so I have just 34 minutes
So
left?
you have like 50 minutes.
Okay. let's just press on then. Let's just press on and we'll finish up a little bit earlier. The last thing that I wanted to address here is the significance for our tradition specifically, for the Apostolic Johannite Church specifically. And it's important to simply say that this is part of our tradition. This is part of where we come from. Do we claim to be Bricoe's church? No. We never have, we never will. Do we claim to be Fabry Palapras church? No, absolutely not. That claim has never been made on behalf of the Apostolic Johannite Church. We are not Fabry Palapras church. We are not Bricoe's church. We are not Doinel's church. We are not Synesius' church. We are not Amblin's church. But we derive much of our tradition and our inspiration from those churches. And that ultimately is much more important than the passage on of certificates and documents and titles and dignities and offices. We are the inheritors of this. We are not the sole inheritors of this. Many, if not most, of the Gnostic churches that are functioning today are similarly inheritors of this tradition. But just as if I inherit something, if I inherit a bunch of money from my long-lost uncle, I can either use that money or I can squander it. The question for each of the Gnostic churches that they have to answer for themselves is, what are we doing with our inheritance? How are we making use of that inheritance? Are we using it simply to inflate our own egos and to trot out our titles and dignities, or are we doing the work of the people? Are we doing the work of the people who are coming to us with a sincere yearning for Gnostic spirituality and a Gnostic symbolism that is infused with power? And that's the question that we ultimately always have to be asking ourselves, especially. Don't worry about anybody else. That's the question that we have to be asking ourselves, especially. So it is part of our tradition. Look at the emphasis that's placed on the Gospel of John from the very beginning, from the very get-go. The Gospel of John comes to the fore in a profound way. And our emphasis on a John spirituality, on a Johannite spirituality, speaks to our inheritance from these early churches. As I said, part of this comes from the historical association with Freemasonry. And as we've made clear on much of our information, much of our literature, Freemasonry, while not an obligatory or an absolute part of our spirituality, those symbols do inform what we do, and many of our clergy and laity have chosen to avail themselves of the opportunities offered through Freemasonry. Much of our understanding of Gnosticism, what we mean by that word, comes not through classical Gnosticism, not through Sethian Gnosticism, not through Valentinian Gnosticism, not from Marcion, not from any of those early classical Gnostic sects, but rather from Doinel's blending, from Doinel's attempt to reconcile these, and to really, in a very real sense, forge Gnosticism in the first place. Because as Professor Pearson was saying, there is no self-identified Gnostic church in the 2nd century AD. It simply doesn't exist. There is no sect that calls itself Gnostic. That Gnosticism is a term that that emerges much, much later. And so when we think of Gnosticism, often what we're thinking of is something that comes from Doinel's synthesis of various streams. And Fabry Palapras, while again we do not claim to be Fabry Palapras Church, we are profoundly inspired by his work, and we are continuing on that work as well as many other churches are. But we are continuing on that work, and that is part of this whole tradition. That comes into this tradition. Bernard Clément's claim to have authority over the Fabry Palapras Church, it's ultimately unconfirmable. and Bricault does not seem to have any authority over that church except through Behun. As a result, no church, including the AJC, can claim to be the successor to Fabry-Palapro's church. No church can claim that. At best, one can claim to have a lineage that extends back to Fabry-Palapro's church. And ultimately, if one church has it, most likely everybody's got it, because it has become so widely disseminated. As I said, that doesn't give us right to claim to be Fabry-Palapro's church any more than the fact that we have successions from the Catholic Church allow us to claim to be the Pope.
Or the Russian Orthodox.
Or the Russian Orthodox Church, or the Russian Orthodox Church in America, or the Russian Orthodox Church in exile,
Right.
or anything like that.
Imperial Russian.
Imperial
Church in
Russian
exile.
Orthodox Church in exile.
And that leads to the next question that becomes strikingly obvious in this place, because there are numerous attempts by various parties to do exactly that, to say that I hold, or I am the key to the one Gnostic church. What exactly does an individual who makes that rather, in light of the lecture that we just had, that rather bogus and ridiculous claim, what actually gives them the right to, at least maybe it's something that they've created in their minds, but what would they base that on? What would they base that claim on?
The general sense that I get is that those kinds of claims are made on the basis of a kind of purity of lineage. And purity is always a fraud idea. It's always a problematic claim. We don't simply have one-to-one handoffs. There are no simple chains of authority. So why do they claim that? That's not my problem. That's ultimately a question that they're going to have to face for themselves. And that's a question they'll have to ask their own consciences. And ultimately, our work is unimpacted by that. Now, you can claim to be anything you want to be. That's not going to change what we do. It's not going to change the work that we do.
I was just going to add the other lineage that comes from Palaprat is the Amblin lineage, which it's a case of if it's there to be had, everybody has it.
Everybody has it. I think that's exactly it.
Right.
If it's there to be had, pretty much everybody has it. So I think that many of these churches, the metaphor that I like to use is that they take two targets and line them up, and fire an arrow at them and say that it hits one and not the other. That they receive, I've received this, you've received that, but I have authority and you don't. That seems to me to be a really specious kind of claim.
I know it's not the point of this talk necessarily, but can you talk a little bit about the lineage of the Ecclesia Gnostica, which claims the English tradition?
Yeah, it is outside of this, and my knowledge of it is deeply lacking.
Okay.
So I would feel out of place trying to make claims about that without doing some more research. The material is out there to be had, and the claims of the EG are relatively straightforward.
Right.
So they're fairly easy to trace. So that's easily, that information is fairly easily obtainable.
That's his way of saying
Stays
people
cool.
that.
Wouldn't it kind of be fair to say that the claim of a lineage, at least having one, is not so much about authority, but about validity?
Yeah, I mean, it ultimately is a question of validity. What gives
What's
us...
the sacraments to be valid?
Yeah, but ultimately, if you've got one, that's all you need.
Right, true.
Yeah.
Why do they have more, I don't know.
But all of us, I mean, I don't want to put the AJC up on a pedestal as if it were better than everybody else. We've received cross consecrations as well, and we try to fuse these lines together, and I think it's just about building an historical basis. It's just about shoring up our own historical foundations. But that ultimately, the foundation is never the house. The foundation is the basis on which you build the house. And you can have a great foundation, but that's not going to keep the rain off your head. You've got to build the house.
I was just going to add to that, if I might, that exchanging consecrations are also sometimes a sign of cooperation, a sign of
Yeah, yeah.
I was
It's a mutual recognition.
I was consecrated by a different bishop, and then got to know the AJC community, and was reconsecrated by Sean. Not to say that my previous consecration was invalid or hinky, but just to say that the AGC and the AJC wanted to work together, and passing on those lineages was a sign of recognition and friendship.
I think that's very important.
Why haven't I flipped this? Can I ask you, Bishop Berdio and Greenfield make a point about egregores being attached to different lines of succession. What's your opinion on that?
I think that I think it's an important idea, and I think that this may in fact be one of the answers to Father Lance's question, that the claim to be the successor is a claim to have a direct and privileged access to that egregore.
Mm-hmm.
That's never a claim that you can establish on the basis of a piece of paper. That's a claim that has to be established through the efficacy of your work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the proof of access to the egregore, the proof of whether that be a privileged access or an access at any point, the proof is in the pudding. It's ultimately going to be a question of how is it working out? How are you impacting the lives of the people around you? What positive impact do you have on the people around you? Similarly, what negative impact do you have on the people around you? How do you make the people around you worse? That tells you something. If you're making the people around you worse people, if you're less of a good person because of your affiliation with me, that says something about me. And so I think that ultimately, those who claim to have privileged access to these egregores, we can test that not through their titles and lineal descents and paperwork, but through the work that they do. You know, when you say the liturgy, when you administer the sacraments to the people,
Or if
when you have a community of believers, not just a guy here that you consecrated and a guy there and a baptism that you did over there, but a community of people. That says something about your access to the egregore.
Isn't that like that's the voice of the Spirit, that kind of concept that the people validate you?
Absolutely, absolutely. What we do is not what Doinel did. What we do is not what Bercot did. What we do is not what Fabre Palaprat did. But we are still inheritors of that tradition as much as anyone.
mm-hmm.
And they are our spiritual forefathers, and we owe it to them as inheritors of that to make good on the promises that they made to their people. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.